2022 Division of Criminal Justice Outstanding Faculty Award for university service, and the 2021 Division of Criminal Justice Outstanding Faculty Award for teaching effectiveness. So we are in for a treat this evening. I would love to be in your classes. Many of her articles, and I have to say she has published many articles, have also garnered awards, including, and I've just isolated this one because it's very recent, the 2021 American Sociological Association Human Rights Section Best Scholarly Article, it was entitled Memory in Interactions, the Remembering and Forgetting of Gender-Based Violence During Atrocity. She consults the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, which is the principal global intergovernmental body exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. Her areas of expertise, she describes herself as a criminologist, and she has focused on mass atrocity, sexual violence, nationalism, collective memory, and especially the aftermath of genocide, of these atrocities, and how that intersects with the legal frameworks. It's not Professor Fox's first visit to South Africa. She visited Stellenbosch University in 2019, where she delivered a paper entitled 25 Years Later, Gendered Challenges in Post-Genocide Rwanda in Achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And she was meant to have returned to South Africa to tour the three centers, the three Holocaust and Genocide centers, to deliver the lecture we're going to hear this evening and to conduct workshops with educators and high school learners. But COVID intervened. And so we're very thrilled now to welcome you at this point, and especially as it follows the publication of your book, which is going to be the focus of the talk this evening. Her book, After Genocide, Memory and Reconciliation in Rwanda, by the way, there are some signed copies over there. It is an academic publication. It was published by the University of Wisconsin in the series, which I found very interesting. It's a series called Critical Human Rights. And I imagine that there are other publications in this series that you added to through your work, which I think is wonderful. And she's already receiving much attention for the book. I've been privileged to read this book, which was the culmination of no less than 10 years of writing and research, including a year spent in Rwanda and many, many journeys back there to do interviews, to visit all the memorial sites, and subsequently she's really become very connected to that country. And so it's very warming for us to have members of the Rwandan community living in Cape Town that are here this evening. A very warm welcome to you, and I know that means a lot to Professor Fox that you have chosen to come. So her talk this evening, as I said, emerges from the research, and it's we'll look at memory and reconciliation in Rwanda after the genocide, and there will be an opportunity for your questions and comments at the end of the talk. So please, I know I've invited some of you personally to ask questions. I understand that in Johannesburg and Durban, where Dr. Fox is, Professor Fox, I know I keep saying Dr. Fox, has spoken that she had so many questions, and I hope that Cape Town is going to live up to our reputation for being an inquiring city. So thank you very much, and with that I'd like to invite Professor Fox to address us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for such a kind and generous introduction. I have to say, not all of my students are thrilled with the reading load that I sometimes assign. I get a little excited about my topics, and so that's my biggest complaint. So Richard, hopefully you would enjoy the classes and not complain about the reading load. It sounds like you wouldn't. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm beyond honored to talk about my work here, and especially at a center that's so powerful, and it's leading the education and the community here for coming. So thank you for coming on, spending an evening with me tonight. And I'll just be able to tell you a little snapshot of some of what I've learned in some of my book, and then I'm happy to answer questions and talk more about some of the larger themes. I wish we had all night, maybe you don't, but to talk to you about my work and the incredible insights that I've gained from talking with some of the bravest people I've ever had the chance to meet. So, okay, let me see. It's not. It's not on. So the first lesson, turn it on or turn it off. So I got it working.
It's working.
It's working. So today's talk, I want to first talk about some of the bigger questions I had in my book, just so that it can give you a little bit of framing for the smaller talk today. And then I'll talk to you about methods, so how I gathered the data, and I'll try to make this short because this is an area that I'm very passionate about, so I'll try not to bore you with my methodology, but if you have questions later, please feel free. And then a brief background. I know probably plenty of you know about Rwanda, maybe have lived in Rwanda, lived through the experience that I'm going to talk about, but for those who maybe are less familiar with Rwanda, to give you a brief background. And then I'll get into the heart of my talk, which is thinking about reconciliation as these everyday experiences and conceptualizing it as what I call everyday reconciliation. And then later, some implications. So why this matters, how this might matter today, how this might matter for South Africa, for Ukraine, for places beyond Rwanda. So these are some of the big questions, which I unfortunately won't be able to talk about today. But basically what I was so interested in is that after the genocide in Rwanda against the Tutsi, there became all of these memorials. And in many ways, for those of you who haven't been to Rwanda, the landscape of memory is quite inescapable. And what I mean by that is it's hard to drive anywhere without noticing a marker or a memorial or a church where individuals were killed, and that then turning into a memorial. And so I wanted to understand these spaces more. And for a while, collective memory, this idea that the past is socially constructed and that it's made from the views of the present day stakeholders or present day community, has been a site of inquiry for sociologists for quite some time, and anthropologists as well. But most of the time what they study is the architect. So how do the buildings shape the viewer's experiences? Some also study how does it sway public opinion? How's it used on the floor of Congress or Parliament? But very few people talked with the very people that these memorials were aimed to commemorate. And so what I wanted to do is kind of answer this call to bring humans back into this study of memory. And so I wanted to ask survivors themselves, what do you think of these spaces? How do they shape your experience? Do they matter? If they do matter, how? And through that, also looking at how is sexual and gender-based violence represented or not represented. Thinking about what kind of work memorials do for individuals after mass atrocity. What are memorials' roles? How do these spaces shape reconciliation or peaceful coexistence? And so these are some of the larger questions. And so in order to answer some of these, I spent a great deal of time in Rwanda interviewing about 70 survivors. And I interviewed them not about how they survived or their experience necessarily of the genocide, although some of that was brought into interviews later on, but what they thought of memorials, how they interacted with them, if they visited them on a regular basis, and if so, why and how. And I interviewed these same groups of survivors multiple times. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to delve in deeper. And so I spent months just hanging out at memorials. I was kind of this lurker that everyone ended up kind of recognizing towards the end. And I wanted to keep visiting the communities that I was engaging with. And so I interviewed folks 3 different times at 3 different points in the calendar year to also see if feelings about memorials or memory or reconciliation, does it change over the calendar year? Does it change seasonally? Is it impacted by some of the mourning months, the anniversaries? And so I had these 3 different phases of research, so interviewing 3 times over 2 years, and then spent another 6 or 7 years coming back to the memorials to see how they've changed, to see what policies or programs were implemented. And I had the chance to continue my relationship with a lot of these. And then I used a software program, because when you have 2 to 4 hours of interviews and you have 70 of those times 3, you end up getting thousands and thousands of pages. So I really had to keep myself organized there. And so before I really get into the talk of today, I want to tell you a story about a woman named Charity, and that's not her real name, that I interviewed. And I just wanted to give a trigger warning for those. I will mention sexual and gender-based violence, and also the violence that occurred in Rwanda during the spring of 1994. So please bear with me during that time. So Charity was 12 years old in 1994 when one of the most heinous atrocities unfolded around her. The president's plane was shot down on April 6, 1994, and her family heard about it through the radio. She lived in the Bugesera district, so right around here on the left part. That's okay. And if you were going to her house, you might see some beautiful view like this. So Charity's community didn't experience the onset of violence immediately. For a while, the men in the village and the women were separated. The women were with the children, and the men were on the hills trying to locate when the perpetrators were coming and fight them off. And Rwanda is known as the land of 1,000 hills. And so these hills were sometimes helpful for survivors to see where perpetrators were coming, but not always. And it also lent to the fact that sometimes survivors could not hide because of these hills. So on a tragic day on April 13th, 1994, the men in the village had gone to one peak, and the women and children were in a local church area. And instead of the perpetrators coming up from the hill like they anticipated, they actually came back around. And so that once they entered in to the village, they bombed the church and killed, I think, around 4,000 people in that church. There were 1,000 more that they then took to kill with machetes, with guns. And many of the men were killed as well. So Charity survived by hiding under the body of her cousin, and she managed to save her 5-month-old baby brother as well. And if you were going to Charity's house, you might see a picture like this and then see a beautiful landscape like such. So Charity, after the genocide, she survived. She experienced sexual assault by some of the militia, but was able to escape still with her 5-month-old brother. And she, at the end of the genocide, was reunited with one of her younger siblings, and then organized and was placed in what was called a child-headed household, where Charity, at 12 years old, became the head of the household, along with several other children that joined her. And the child-headed households look something like this. And so I was talking with Charity on one of the days and asking her, because she was telling me about how Rwanda was going in the direction of light, it was coming out of the darkness of genocide. And so I asked her about reconciliation, and she said, yes, reconciliation is indeed occurring in Rwanda. And I would say about 70 out of the 72 people I spoke with said it was occurring. And I had a conversation like this one with most of the people, so most of the survivors. So I asked Charity, so tell me how is reconciliation occurring? And she said, well, reconciliation is when a survivor, when a perpetrator admits guilt, comes to the survivor, the victim's family, asks for forgiveness, and the person can decide if they want to pardon them. And I said, that's fascinating, and yet I'd heard this many times before. And so I said, well, has that happened to you? And Charity says, no. I said, well, have you witnessed it? And she said, no. I said, well, what about anyone else? Anyone else experienced this process? No. And so this is when, luckily, I had gotten this answer several times before and realized that I did not know what was going on, and that I needed to humbly redo my interview guide and ask some better questions, because what I was getting is that this formula was occurring, or that this formula represented reconciliation, yet it wasn't occurring. So what else was going on? And so I asked, if this has not happened and you feel reconciliation is still occurring, then what does reconciliation mean to you? And she said, my neighbor will take me to the hospital if I need to go, even if he's a different ethnicity than me, and there's no longer laws about education. And what this lent me is insight that reconciliation had both this micro level, which was more of a state-sponsored, top-down idea of what reconciliation should be, which ended in a process of social harmony. In a lot of ways, this would be reconciliation as product, and this next one would be reconciliation as process. And so here, then, I realized that reconciliation was also happening on the micro level. And these were descriptions of what we might think of as mundane activities or interactions of interethnic coexistence. And so this then brought me to a new research question and the inquiry that I'll be talking with you today about. And that is thinking about how do survivors navigate between these competing narratives of both this micro level and this macro level, and do these understandings change over time? But also what I wanted to know is, how do people experience reconciliation, or what they call reconciliation? What does that mean? What does it look like or feel like or sound like, or what is that experience actually on the ground? And then second, how does the more utopian view that ends in social harmony, how does that interact with the micro? And so here's what I learned. But first, just a brief history of the case of Rwanda, and just I have the brevity of this is in no way indication of the simplicity of the history, because it's a very complex history. So I'm going to do my best here in a very short time. But originally, prior to colonization, there were three groups, but these three groups were quite fluid. So there were Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. Twa were potters, Hutu were agriculturalists, and Tutsi owned cows. But if someone were a Hutu and then owned more cows, then they would become a Tutsi. And really the organization, the social organization at the time prior to colonialism was clans and kingdoms. And so these three groups shared the same language, shared the same culture, and intermarried. And it wasn't necessarily social harmony at this time, because whenever you have kingdoms or clans, there's stratification, right? So there's people at the top and people at the bottom, but this stratification was not based on ethnicity, and that is the key takeaway of this. But when colonization occurred, and first with German colonial rule and then with Belgium, things started to change. So Germany, in the great grab for Africa, got Rwanda, and what they wanted to do is rule from afar. And how do you rule from afar? You divide the people and turn them against each other. And this was a tactic of colonialism, and in many cases, unfortunately, Rwanda not being unique. So Germany, in a lot of ways, practiced the eugenics that they later practiced on the Jews on Rwandans. So there were measuring of noses and skulls, deemed that certain were more European than others. When Germany lost World War I and Belgium came in, Belgium really solidified this social order of ethnic identities. They brought in the white fathers of the Catholic, come on in. They brought in the white fathers of the Catholic Church, and Belgium instituted identity cards, which were key in the genocidal violence. And so Belgium did the same, creating Tutsis as the category that were more European. So therefore, they were more trusted in terms of ruling from afar. And so Tutsis got far more privileges than Hutu with their connections to the Catholic Church, because at the time, really, the state and the church were quite intertwined. In 1962, there was a movement for independence, and that's really when the dynamics changed. So Hutus then had a Hutu manifesto, gained access to resources and opportunities that they didn't have before, and Tutsis started to get oppressed through quotas and also violence. So there were massacres of Tutsis in 1959, 1962, and again in 1972 as well. In 1962 and then on, France really had quite a role in Rwanda and kind of neo-colonial rule, and we can talk about that later if anyone's interested, but they were essential in importing weapons to the militia at the time. So we're now in the context of a civil war in which those who were exiled to Uganda form an opposition movement, attack Rwanda from the inside. Rwanda then attacks back, and we have a civil war, economic turmoil. Rwanda is owing the IMF, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is not releasing on any of the loans across Africa. And that's another thing. And we have what we think of as the trigger. So we have all of these dynamics in place that make genocide possible, but the trigger is what starts it. And that was the assassination of President Habyarimana on April 6, 1994, and immediately after killings began. So roadblocks were there so people couldn't escape. Previously, sacred or safe spots such as churches, mosques, those were no longer safe spots, but actually places where perpetrators aimed to kill Tutsis in masses. And so you see now in a country of 7 million, 1 million people were killed in 100 days. It's hard to kind of overestimate or over-describe the destruction of a genocide and of a community that experiences genocidal violence on this level. And so in the aftermath, you have the loss of a generation. You have individuals who are traumatized. You also have a refugee crisis in which 1 million people led to the borders, and then 1 million people were coming back who were in exile. So you see this transition of people. You see the infrastructure that's destroyed. An estimated of 350,000 women were raped. So you have women who are now pregnant as well and experiencing also sexually transmitted diseases such as AIDS and HIV. And so you have no formal government. And so in the aftermath, there were several mechanisms of what we might call transitional justice. So justice that's temporary, justice that may be restorative, and that's where you try to transition a country from the destruction of genocide to a more democratic functioning. And they entertained a truth commission, got more and diverse public symbols and national symbols such as the flag. The ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, began, and that had 93 indictments costing millions and millions of dollars. And then also gacaca courts, which were courts that were on the ground, local courts that were based on on ways of solving problems that was indigenous to Rwandans prior to colonialism. And those tried 2 million cases, so I'm happy to talk about that as well. And so then we see this new move, and as well as memorialization, the creation of permanent memorials to those who perished in the genocide. So prior knowledge about reconciliation, in some ways reconciliation is thought of as the black box, like how do we understand it and how do we measure it? And most of the time reconciliation is measured from these large top-down mechanisms. So if you're thinking about like development goals and development markers, the UN uses that to try to measure both internal and external peace. We also have reconciliation barometers, which measures public opinion, and actually South Africa had one of those. There's also ones that measure on 23 different indicators, 163 countries, and compares them with internal and external markers of peacefulness. And so while these give us a nice picture of the broader world of reconciliation and who has access to education and clean drinking water, a lot of people have critiqued some of these mechanisms as that they don't actually talk to the people. And that you can see this parallel now with memorialization research as well, and that there's a call to bring reconciliation measures to become a little bit more local, a little bit more specific, and a little bit more people-focused. And this would then be more of a ground-up approach, right? So we would talk to people, we would then have it be localized and community organized. And so this actually kind of really spoke to me when I was talking to people. So these are some of the inquiries that I had, the many inquiries that I had about reconciliation, to try to learn from those that were living in Rwanda after surviving some of the worst atrocities of humankind. And so what I wanted to do is ask kind of, how do you know it's occurring? What would show you that reconciliation is occurring? And what are some of the markers of it? And how has it changed for you? And what does it mean in your life that these are occurring? And so these were some of the questions that were my revision after I had asked questions and realized that they weren't the right ones. And they weren't really lending people to tell a more complicated story. And so what I learned is that there was indeed what I call in my book a reconciliation formula. And in many ways, Rwanda isn't unique to this particular reconciliation. You see actually some of this echoed in Desmond Tutu's early work, the pathways to forgiveness that he mentioned. And you see this also because it has some kind of Christian roots to this as well, and thinking about confession and forgiveness. And so what this process would look like is that a perpetrator admits guilt, tells the truth, the perpetrator seeks forgiveness, and then the victim pardons. But as I mentioned to you, it wasn't really occurring so much. And so as a sociologist and a criminologist, I like to think like when stories are told and retold, what's their purpose? Because if they're getting retold, it means they're serving some kind of purpose. And so I inquired why this story might be told and retold so much, even though it wasn't necessarily happening outside those instances in the Gacaca courts. And so what I wanted to know is, why is it that this is shared and reshared? And some of the reasons why this is that a story that's compelling is retold. And this story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's very clear. In a lot of ways, it organizes one of the most disorganized events in human experience, and that is violence of this level. And so it also has a promise, right? A promise of forgiveness, a promise of social harmony. Even if social harmony wasn't necessarily in existence prior, it's a promise to return to something that everybody always wanted. But also it had some promise in terms of, this was echoed by the Rwandan government, but also it was echoed by the West quite a bit. And so as I was writing my book for these many years, this decade, almost every year I would open the New York Times around April, and what I would find is pictures of perpetrators next to their victims, smiling or back to back. And this narrative of the reconciliation formula. And I think what this did too is it impacted aid, it impacted tourism. And it was a nice story that the West could tell too, especially given their inaction and their abandonment of Rwandans when they knew that the genocide was unfolding. And so, so outside of that, then there exists this whole other world of micro interactions and micro reconciliation practices. And what I noticed about these is that they happened on a couple different levels, and that's one thing I think is important to distinguish. There were state level kind of these micro interactions, and there was community level. And so today I'm just going to talk with about three of these, each of these, and give you a couple of quotes from the folks that I talked to, and then in my book I have quite a few more outlined. And so the first one is memorials. These memorials were a site where people marked that reconciliation on the part of the government was occurring, that the government made this effort to memorialize, to validate. And so these memorials, these spaces were physical markers of what they found to be reconciliation. And so you see Audrey here says, memorials validate survivors, showing the government honors the victims of the genocide, preventing genocide from occurring again. And Audrey wasn't alone in believing that these memorials were active in the prevention of future violence and a brighter future. And then another state level indicator was access to education. And while there was equal access in terms of gender and ethnicities, there still is a rural and urban divide as well as a class divide that you see across urban landscapes, really I would argue globally. But what we see here is that especially around older adults that I interviewed and very young survivors that are interviewed, so not necessarily this middle generation, this was a marker for them. And I believe it's because older generations remembered the quotas. They remembered when people didn't have access to education because of their ethnicity. And I believe it's because younger people are reminded and then entering into that education. And so I'll never forget Marie. And Marie said that her mother remembers when Tutsi in her village couldn't go to the school. They wanted without being humiliation, and here I am. I finished college and I have a respectable job. And Marie actually worked at one of the memorials that I studied, and she was so proud of getting an education, and so was her mother. And part of her pride was also the pride of her mother, right? So this intergenerational. And then the last state level was what I would call reparations, but social services to survivors. And this was really key. So clause says services bring up survivors so they can be part of their communities. And then Rebecca's comment, I think, is something I'll come back to. That's a key lesson to all of us in terms of transitional justice or the aftermath of mass atrocity. And that's that you can't discuss reconciliation unless you discuss hunger and poverty. And how can you discuss forgiveness with someone who is hungry or doesn't have a home? So how important just getting these basic ways of life back in order before you're talking about reconciliation. And I believe this is true in many cases. And so now transitioning into the communal level. So what's happening on really the community-based level rather than the government and the state level. So we think about sharing public space. And this was talked about across the board with so many people about the sharing the public space of bus stations, and so or of bathrooms or cafes or public spaces of parks. And so Fideli says, at the market everyone is there. No one asks you, are you a Hutu or Tutsi? This is progress. So I bring us back to Charity here, but Charity was not alone in talking about the dependency of others, feeling like You no longer fear that your neighbor's going to poison you. You feel like you can share water if you need to. You can share a lift if you need one to the hospital. And this was something that was also revisited time and time again with different survivors. And the last communal level is physical safety. And I saw this particularly with women and with the older generation of those survivors that I interviewed. And I think this is often because the older generation remembers so much of the violent uprisings that occurred, and in particular the women, because they also experienced the constant threat of sexual and gender-based violence. And that threat was a deliberate tactic in terms of humiliating, but also creating sustained fear of entire communities and not just women in the community. And I'd be happy to talk about the gender-based violence later on as well if anyone has questions. But you've seen as it talks about this, I no longer fear about being raped, having nightmares about running from rape. So why should you care about this? Why should researchers care about this? What does this teach us in the broader landscape of post-atrocity or post-mass violence? And so there's a couple methodological ones. And so I'm thinking about other case studies where we see this. And what I've learned from this is that there's different versions of reconciliation that can operate at the same time. So they're not mutually exclusive, but rather they're operating in these social worlds at the same time. And to recognize that can happen, and that it doesn't mean that one is good and one is bad, or one is right or wrong, but that these are processes that are occurring simultaneously. So the next one is for me the importance of in-depth interviews and being able to come back to people and ask them questions again and again. Also to show that their story is important, that their story is valued, and that you want to get their story right. But also follow-up questions, right? So my first question, if I were to have left it at that, I would be telling you a much different story. I would be telling you that everybody is getting pardoned, that everybody's voice is, or everyone's getting asked for forgiveness. And that wouldn't necessarily have been an accurate portrayal of what's going on. But last, also, the temporal variation. What I mean by this is people actually did have different stances or feelings on forgiveness or reconciliation at different points in time. And so what I found is that when I talked with survivors about forgiveness or reconciliation during the mourning months, they were less inclined to believe that that was indeed possible. They did not feel like that was something, and some were even angry at me, even though it was a similar question I had asked before. How dare you ask me about forgiveness? How dare you ask me about reconciliation? And so what this tells us as researchers is that these annual memorials are not the best time to launch coexistence programs or reconciliation. We should let people mourn and let people experience that, and then engage in coexistence programs at another time. And so if someone were to launch something and it would likely fail during these mourning months. One other thing is the importance of disaggregating the data in terms of thinking about people and their social location, which is the second one, and that is gender and generation. So some of the traditional literature says that women are the most forgiving species, right? They're naturally nurturing, and they really care for society, and therefore they're probably the more forgiving species. But what I've actually found is the opposite. Women were less inclined to think about forgiveness as an option on the table than men. And so if we proceed with these gendered assumptions about and go with our biological essentialism of who men and women are, then we might actually mischaracterize some of the dynamics that are going on. Also, we have to think about generations remember things differently. Generations have different experiences, and generations likely have different points of remembrance of when things turned, when things changed. We find that in the US as well when we study generational memory, where certain generations have, this is the foundational event, this is the foundational event, and it changes across the generations. But also how important it might be to really also separate our analysis for what are reconciliation markers that are happening at the state versus what's happening in the community amongst people, and thinking about those things as operating simultaneously but yet on different levels. So we know that stories are told and retold for a reason, and I mentioned this, but what I might say is that sometimes stories time out. And what I mean by that is that this reconciliation formula has maybe run its course. So I could imagine in the beginning this reconciliation brought great hope to a lot of people. It gave the promise of learning where your loved ones' bodies were buried, the promise that someone would come to you and ask for forgiveness, and you would have the power and the agency to grant them that. But as I was interviewing, about 18 years had passed. And so as you are waiting for that person to provide you with the information of where your loved one was buried, maybe what your loved one's last words are, and that never comes to fruition, there then becomes some resistance and some anger and disappointment. And so in a lot of ways, this then, the everyday coexistence that I mentioned to you, the shared experience of riding a bus together or having access to education, it really pales in comparison to this larger promise. And so in a lot of ways, the everyday reconciliation is filtered through the lens of this great promise that hasn't come. And so one of my participants said it best in that, yes, I feel safe in my home. And I guess that's progress, but I do not know the truth about what happened to my brother, so no, and that still haunts me. And so here with this, you can see that this promise of wanting to know where his brother's ashes are, his brother's bones, bodies, that really haunts him in a way that it makes these social interactions feel a little bit less like progress. And so that brings me to one of my final slides here, which is thinking about the implications after mass atrocity and some priorities that we should do. And I think about Ukraine a lot in this. I think about the violence that's been happening in Ethiopia with the farm herders conflict in Nigeria, and that how important it is that when there is mass violence, that there's an investment in the forensic technology to exhume the bodies and to identify them for loved ones. And so in Rwanda, they had quite a bit less resources in the area of forensic technology, while Bosnia had quite a bit. So Bosnia has located and identified many of these, the people who were killed in the genocide there. And the second one is that comment that I mentioned early on, and the importance of making sure the basic needs of survivors are met. So that may be in the form of reparations, giving money and allocation for healthcare, for education, for the rebuilding, because we can't expect that survivors can then engage in any type of reconciliation or lead the movement in that unless their physical needs are met. And so I think about Rwanda as actually a place that we can learn so much from because of their efforts to memorialize. And I also think about the resilience of people like Charity who are sharing their stories so that we can learn from them. And I was forever humbled and honored to learn from them. So thank you very much for having me here today. I am happy to answer any questions, and thanks for having me.